infrared UFO departure heat field radio if you will relate this to cases that you are familiar with, as far as appearance, spectrum shift when in flight, etc. You will see the applicability of the above diagram. When UFOs stabilize in our dimension, they radiate energy on all frequencies and become glowing white. Radical maneuvers require a frequency alteration, which produces color changes. It is interesting to know that in Blue Book Report number 14, they replaced the phrase electromagnetic phenomenon with the word unknown in a majority of those cases. Why? There is no doubt that again, the situation exists where we have multiple realities within the UFO realm as well. It is clear that we are not dealing with random get visitors. It has an extreme element of intention to do with all of it. Mutilations started in April 1897 with the abduction of Alexander Hamilton's calf, witnessed by several people. That is one of the constants that has been with us, that has not changed frame of reference. How many people give thought to the 3 dark-skinned wise men who appeared before the birth of Jesus, spread the reality of the happening, and disappeared again? All the dark-skinned men in threes? Myth? It makes you wonder. Charting the enigma well. Here we are again. Taking a sample of 33% of 10,000 or so cases, or about 3,330 cases, we find that 730 are so-called Type I, a low-level object observed and reported by reliable witnesses. It was found that 2,600 were Type II, high-altitude objects performing in a controlled manner and distinct from normal aircraft and natural phenomena. The time of the sightings depends on where you are. If you are in a rural area, sightings conveniently begin after 10 p.m. The populated area would have them between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. for some reason. In many flaps, Wednesday had about 20.5% of the sightings. Now, if the UFO phenomenon, and I dislike that word, had a purely psychic basis, then I would think there would be more sightings on a Saturday, when people are statistically out and about, than on Wednesday. There are notable exceptions to everything, of course, one of which was the flap of August 16, 1966, which was on a Tuesday. Reports seem to cluster within political boundaries of states, as if there were a methodical exploration of states from border to border. If the UFO were a natural occurrence, one would expect otherwise. Thousands of sightings can be fitted into the Great Circle route, and often the dates are staggered so that it appears that the phenomenon moves systematically from point to point. Every state in the United States has from 2 to 10 windows. These are areas where UFOs appear repeatedly year after year. The objects will appear in these places and pursue courses confined to sectors with a radius of about 200 miles. The Great Circle from Canada, not to be confused with the traditional Great Circle in the Northwest, through the central states and back into Northeast Canada, is a major window. Hundreds of smaller windows lie within that circle. Another major window is centered in the Gulf of Mexico and encompasses much of Mexico, Texas, and the Southwest. As mentioned previously, many windows center directly over area of magnetic deviation. UFOs seem to congregate about the highest available hills in these window areas. They become visible in these centers and then radiate outward, traveling sometimes 100 to 00 miles before disappearing again. Among the great heaps of neglected and ignored UFO data, we find hundreds of many people accounts. These are very rarely published anywhere because they tend to be so unbelievable. Most of them are identical to the fairy and bone stories of yesteryear. Witnesses to these events can experience conjunctivitis, akinesia, paralysis, amnesia, and the other effects often noted by witnesses to more conventional events. One notable event is one that occurred in Seattle, Washington, in the latter part of August 1965. A woman awoke around 2 a.m. and discovered she could not move a muscle or make a sound. Her window was open, and suddenly a tiny, football-sized dull gray object floated through the window and hovered over the carpet near her bed. 3 legs lowered from the object and it settled to the floor. A small ramp extended from it and 5 or 6 tiny people clambered out and seemed to work on some kind of repairs on the object. They wore tight-fitting clothing. When they were finished, they got in and the object took off and sailed out the window. At that point, she was able to move. The case was investigated by J. Russell Jenkins of Seattle. You can readily see why almost none of these kinds of stories ever appear in print, except in occult-oriented literature. Nevertheless, if we hope to assess the true UFO situation, we must examine all these stories. We can learn nothing by considering only those incidents which are emotionally and intellectually acceptable to us. Time is one of the most important aspects of the UFO thing. It plays a strange but significant role. Part of the answer may not lie in the stars, but in the clock ticking on your fireplace. Our world exists in 3 dimensions. We can move in many directions within these dimensions. Space does not exist except when we make it exist. To us, the distance between atoms in our matter is so minute that it can only be calculated with hypothetical measurements. Yet, if we lived on an atom, and our size was relative to its size, the distance to the next atom would seem awesome. There is another man-made measurement called time. Unlike the other 3 dimensions, time has us seemingly trapped. Time becomes very real to us, and it appears that we couldn't live without it. Yet time doesn't really exist at all. This moment exists to us. Does this mean the same moment is being shared by other planets? The UFO phenomenon does seem to be controlled. It does follow intelligent patterns. If the objects themselves are manifestations of higher energies, then something has to manipulate those energies somehow and reduce them to the visible frequencies. Not only do they enter the visible frequencies, but they take forms which seem physical and real to us, and they carry out actions which seem to be intelligent. Thus we arrive at the source. The source has to be a form of intelligent energy operating at the highest possible point of the frequency spectrum. If such an energy exists at all, it might permeate the universe and maintain equal control of each component part. Because of its very high frequency, so high that the energy particles are virtually standing still, the source has no need to replenish itself in any way that would be acceptable to our environmental sciences. It could actually create and destroy matter by manipulating the lower energies. It would be timeless, because it exists beyond all time fields. It would be infinite, because it is not confined by 3-dimensional space. Children figure neatly into this, and they always have. The child's mind, especially before the so-called age of reason, when the logic circuits begin to form, is a clear instrument, open and uninfluenced by opinions and conclusions. This is an important point in the UFO mystery. Perhaps if we were in a pure energy state, each particle of energy would itself serve as a synapse, and information could be stored by a slight alteration in frequency. All the memory fragments of the rows, for example, would be recorded at one frequency, and the whole energy form could tune into that memory by adjusting frequencies, as we might adjust the radio receiver. In other words, no complex circuitry would be required. Nobody would be necessary. The energy patterns would not need material form. It would permeate the entire universe. It could surround you completely at this very moment and be aware of all the feeble impulses of low energy passing through your brain. If it so desired, it could control those pulses and thus control your thoughts. Man has always been aware of this intelligent energy or force. He has always worshipped it. Our first conclusion is that the UFOs originate from beyond our own time frame or time cycle. Our second conclusion is that the source has total foreknowledge of human events and even of individual lives. Since time and space are not absolutes, these two conclusions are compatible. It is that all human events occur simultaneously when viewed by a greater intelligence. If a greater intelligence wants to communicate with a lower form, all kinds of problems are presented. The communication must be conducted in a manner which will be meaningful and understandable to the lower life form. An acceptable frame of reference must be found and utilized. UFO phenomenon, especially the soft ones, are frequently reflective, that is, the observed manifestations seem to be deliberately tailored and adjusted to the individual beliefs and attitudes of the witnesses. Contactees are given information which, in most cases, conforms to their beliefs. UFO researchers who concentrate on one particular aspect toward theory find themselves inundated with seemingly reliable reports which seem to substantiate the theory. John Keel's extensive experiences with this reflective factor led him to carry out weird experiments which confirmed that a large part of the reported data is engineered and deliberately false. The witnesses are not the perpetrators, but merely the victims. The apparent purpose of all this false data is multifold. Much of it is meant to create confusion and diversion. Some of it has served to support certain beliefs which were erroneous but which would serve as stepping stones to the higher, more complex truth. Whole generations have come and gone, happily believing in the false data, unaware that they were mere links in the chain. If it were all understood too soon, we might crumble under the weight of the truth. This earth is covered with windows into those other unseen worlds. If we had the instruments to detect them, we would find that these windows are the focal points for super high frequency waves, the rays of ancient lore. These rays might come from the Orion or the Pleiades as the ancients claimed, or they might be part of the great force that emanates throughout the universe. The UFOs have given us the evidence that such rays exist. Now, slowly, we are being told why. It is also apparent that some entities are having a good laugh at our expense. As mentioned before, literature indicates that the phenomenon carefully cultivated the religious frame of reference in early times, just as the modern manifestations have carefully supported the extraterrestrial frame of reference. The devil's emissaries of yesteryear have been replaced by the mysterious men in black. A major, but little explored, aspect of the UFO phenomenon is therefore theological and philosophical rather than purely scientific. The UFO problem can't never be untangled by physicists and scientists unless they are men who also are schooled in the other disciplines. The earth was occupied before man arrived or was created. That's an important point to consider. The original occupants were paraphysical and possessed the power of transmutation of matter. Man was the interloper. The inevitable conflict arose between physical man and the paraphysical owners of the planet. Man accepted the interpretation that this conflict raged between his creator and the devil. The religious viewpoint has always been that the devil has been attacking man, trying to get rid of him by causing havoc upon him. There is historical and modern proof that this may be so. It is interesting that psychologists have long concluded that the paralysis that contactees experience is a contributing cause, that the entity may materialize by utilizing energy from the percipient himself. John Keel has in his files hundreds of cases, some of which have now been investigated by qualified psychiatrists, in which young men and women obsessed with the UFO phenomenon have suffered frightening visits from apparitions, followed up by mysterious black Cadillacs which appeared and disappeared suddenly, and have been terrified into a mere pursuit of the UFOs. The phenomenon is again reflective in nature. The more frightened the victim becomes, the more the manifestations are escalated.